Welcome back to the Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. As you know, the Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire, developing innovative technology for reducing the harmful effects of wildfire while leaving the rest of the fire alone. Because, right, the reason we have such a wildfire problem is because we put out too many wildfires. Okay, well, but enough on that. I've got a really cool guest with me. I've got Keith Gill with me. Now, Keith is one of the guys who did one of the cooler things in firefighting, right? When we think about firefighting, imagery wise, we think about, the airplanes and the aerial crafts dropping the red stuff, heroically swooping in, knocking the fire down, saving the firefighters' lives, stopping buildings from burning up. Well, Keith piloted those aircraft for more than 40 years and has done, I don't know how much this is, but 7 logbooks worth of aerial firefighting. Keith, welcome to the show. How are you?
Oh, my pleasure to be here, Steve. I'm well.
Well, it's a tribute to your safety record that you're still around, because one of the things we see frequently in aerial firefighting is a unfortunate merger of airplanes and earth, with resultant fatalities. I saw a lot of that over the summer in Greece, in Santa Fe, uh, California, and Canada. I guess as we fight more wildfires and put more guys in the air, this is an increasing risk.
That's unfortunately quite true. I've never had a year where I haven't lost a friend or somebody I knew quite well. So it is unfortunate, but it's one of the risks that most people accept, although you can't always pin it down to somebody who's operating more safely. Some of the finest pilots I ever knew, who I thought would always outlive me, didn't. And you do what you can, but if your number's up, that's just it. Unfortunately, for a lot of people.
But I imagine as a pilot, slash scientist, you don't think about it as a lottery, numbers wise, because I know in your industry there's a lot of beneficial Monday morning quarterbacking. What can we learn about what happens so this doesn't happen to other people? So, what are some of the commonalities that you saw in these fatal incidents?
Yeah, well, like I alluded to, some of them were nobody's fault at all. I mean, this industry can be exactly that cruel. Somebody has a problem with an aircraft or a situation, and they do all the right things, but they still don't make it. And then there's other people who fly like there's no tomorrow, everything's going to be fine for them, and they manage to make it to the end of their career. I'm somewhere in the middle of that, and then I started off being invincible and bulletproof, and then realized with a bit of time that I was very lucky to be where I was and to live through some foolish decisions on my part. But you don't get to last a long time, as I think I did at 48 years, by continuing those kind of errors. So the the general statement I would take out of all of that is learn from the mistakes of others. You'll never live long enough to make them all yourself, and then go from there.
So, yeah, that's the difference between wise and smart, right?
Yeah,
Smart people
exactly.
learn from their mistakes, and wise people learn from the mistakes of others.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So
Exactly
tell me
true.
about some of the highlights of your career. What you flew and where you flew, and some of the fires that
Hmm.
you fought.
Yeah, well, I flew about 40 some different types of helicopters and fixed wings. I did start off early in my career flying light fixed wings and transitioned into larger aircraft like the Twin Otter and the DC-3, which I flew in the Arctic in Canada. The DC-3, I was fortunate to fly with a lot of uh, men who had managed to survive World War II and had done the Berlin airlift and that kind of thing. So any mission they undertook was easier if nobody was shooting at them. So they were good at what they did. And I looked at that and thought, as a 20-year-old, it'd be more exciting to be a helicopter pilot, which I wasn't looking down the road uh, to my mid 60s when I would have realized, wait, you might not have as much money as somebody in the airlines, so wouldn't that be nice? But I transitioned to helicopters in 74, and I was happy to do so. It was a relatively new business then, so I got into that and worked as what would popularly be called a bush pilot in Canada, and then moved to the U.S. In 1985, and that's when my firefighting side of it started. Although I had done other things in between, that was around the start of firefighting, and primarily then in North America, and then later on, mostly overseas. I wanted to work overseas a lot because I liked what I saw there versus some of the things that I found frustrating dealing with the governments that I found in both Canada and the U.S. and their procedures and their methodology. The Europeans didn't have the luxury of doing things differently. They basically had to go and put fires out, and the aircraft that I flew were ideally suited for that. So it was a good combination for me.
So tell me about, without naming names or pointing blames, but what are they doing in Europe that you saw that you think we should be doing here?
And I would add to that list Australia as well.
On the good side or the bad side?
On the good side,
Okay.
as far as now, certain states, without getting into too much boring detail, certain states tend to model themselves after the U.S. Forest Service model, but some don't, and Europe does not. The thing about the European firefighting system is they don't have the luxury of having large fires. So their initial attack, and they will put everything they have on a fire and not worry about the perceived costs or the fact that you might have to turn aircraft around if they're not necessarily needed. Italy, Greece, and Turkey, although I've worked a little bit with France, work on that model. If they get a fire, they know that the people on the ground have somewhat limited assets and certainly limited sources of water to work with. So they need to send everything they've got and hit it hard. And so most of the time in Europe, I would be surprised if I flew more than a day on a fire. Most times, a cycle, about 2 hours, or possibly two cycles to clean things up. And so, initial attack is the way they handle things. There's other reasons why North America does things differently, and it's quite complicated, and it's also a sensitive subject for some people. But I liked, because of what I was doing and what I wanted to accomplish, initial attack with one of the best helicopters for initial attack in the business was a perfect scenario for me. I worked in Europe in the summer and Australia in the winter, so it was a good situation, and I was doing what I wanted to do with the helicopter as well.
Although they call it summer down there.
They do, yeah.
Right.
They call it.
So the strategy that you saw being used in Australia and in Europe was essentially it's cheaper in terms of the total losses and the effort to throw everything you have at a small fire while it's smaller than to risk it getting larger and taking longer to put out. And that makes a lot of sense.
That would be a good
what are the obstacles to that? What are the obstacles to that here? Is it, nobody makes money on a fire that gets put out right away, or?
Well, I don't know that I'd want to go down that road because I can't
And I
speak
don't
for
either. And I didn't
people in the
actually say
business.
that,
But
right.
but you're not wrong in that in certain cases that appears to be what's going on. But sometimes because, well, okay, I'll start from the beginning and see if I can sum it up without getting everybody writing me nasty letters. But the U.S. Forest Service as an entity is not really a firefighting government entity. It is a forest management government entity that found itself doing firefighting. And I would like, before I pass on, to see firefighting completely removed from the U.S. Forest Service and put onto FEMA or a branch of FEMA where it should be. I think people who want to take care of forests probably have a slightly different view on what to do when there's a fire. As an example, a lot of times you can't get the budget to do a prescribed burn, and you can't get the public on board, and you can't do the things that you could be doing to eliminate some of the risk from fire, particularly in the urban interface, where I know you're more than interested in that. So when a fire occurs, it's easy to be in the fire management business if you're, as an example, the U.S. Forest Service, and go, well, look at this mountainside. We've been wanting to do a burn here for X number of years, but we've got so much pushback, we haven't been able to do it. Now we've got a fire. It's got rolling for whatever reason it got rolling. And now we're going to manage it and back burn an area that's 3 times larger than the actual fire, or maybe 10 times larger than the actual fire, because we're in an emergency budget situation, whereas a prescribed burn was a budget that had to fall within the district, and the district didn't have the money, and it had all kinds of people that said, oh, we don't want the smoke in our neighborhood, we don't want our trails burned up. And well, yeah, but once it gets going, you'll have all of that, right? So now you have a chance to manage a fire, to get accomplished what you didn't have the budget or the wherewithal or the will to accomplish previously. Did I explain that?
Yeah. You're saying essentially a prescribed burn was necessary. It was not funded or tolerated or approved.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now it's forced on you because there's already a fire in the area.
Right.
And now we're just going to let that fire do all of the things that we wish we had been able to do by prescription because it has to get done. And now that there's an active fire, doing that prescribed burn, managed burn, now falls under a different budget category where we can let it go.
Right.
And so this would be a reason why once a fire started, rapid attack might not be in the long-term best interest, because it's in the long-term best interest to let that fire burn off some of the surplus fuels in the area.
Exactly. I should have you as my editor for a couple of my books.
I'd be happy. Send over the manuscript.
But yeah, that's what I saw a lot of in North America, and that would be, as you can appreciate, for somebody who wants to do initial attack and put out a fire, sitting by watching something happening, knowing that instead of spending a couple of days here, I was likely to spend a couple of weeks sitting smoked in at some base where we can't even get out to fight the fire because of an unfortunate choice in location, because it looks good to the public, apparently, to have aircraft sitting there. But people have got to be wondering, well, why are they not out there fighting a fire? Well, they're not out there fighting a fire because they chose a location that's in the public eye. But the other side of that sword is it's in the public eye, but they can see you doing nothing because you can't get out till 1 o'clock in the afternoon when the wind comes up and clears the smoke out. Well, what does the wind also do? It also gets that fire ripping to a point that you're not going to say useless, but you're of questionable value when it's crowning through the tops. You should have been out there calming things down, if we're managing it, until we can get the job accomplished. But it got to the point where my employers were pulling me off some of these larger fires because I was saying what I thought about the efforts. And so it was easier to go to a foreign country where nobody really understood me, but appreciated the fact that
they just won't know what you're saying.
Yeah, I was putting fires out in 2 to 4 hours. So that's really all they wanted. That was what was expected. But it's a different scenario in certain parts of the U.S. Now, Southern California would be an exception, right? You can appreciate how densely populated it is. And when they get a fire there, they're generally going after it right now, unless it's on the urban interface. And then they face so much potential pushback on urban interface that they don't really do what they're capable of doing. And let me give you an example. In Greece, we'll get a fire roar into a town, right? And I get to the town with my crew, and I've got 3 houses burning. 2 of them are pretty much consumed. One of them's just getting rolling, right? And I'll put a load right through the roof of that house and put that fire out so that it doesn't go down the street and catch the rest of the houses on fire. Now, there's just no way, if you don't mind me saying, there's no way in hell the U.S. Forest Service would ever let me put a load through a roof of a house or a barn or anything else to stop that fire, unless it was so consumed that it didn't make a difference. But in other countries, we do that without any recourse because they know you're doing the best you can. You stopped it from going through the village, and that was successful. So it's a
when the
different
houses are
mindset.
the trees, right?
Yeah.
You've got, just like you'd cut down some trees to stop the fire moving from X to Z, you might have to take out some houses to create the fire break if there's no other opportunity.
Yeah, but I can't say you'd never do that in the U.S., but it would be very unusual to see that unless the house was, 80% gone and the flames are 60 feet in the air. But and of course we don't build houses in North America like they do in other countries. They build houses in Europe as if nobody's coming to help them, right? They're made out of stone and heavy stucco and slate roofs and steel covered windows. I mean, here we build houses out of kindling and they're up in a month and burned down in an hour. So, it doesn't have to be that way, but that's the way it is.
It sounds like a very similar situation to, what we saw in the Fort McMurray fire in Alberta, where they had to bulldoze blocks of unburning houses in order to create the fire break. And the alternative was you'd lose the whole town.
Exactly. Yeah. Because houses were built for people who didn't want to live in McMurray, but it was a great place to make a living, right? So they didn't really care what they lived in. It was only a place to sleep about 9 hours a day and make enough money and get the hell out of Fort McMurray, if you don't mind using that language. But I've been there. I've been all over North America, so I know exactly what
So who do you think is doing it right? You say Europe in general. Are there countries we should really be looking to that are modeling the type of fire management and fire attack?
Greece
you'd say
is
if the
starting
U.S.
to
could do it like anyone,
get handled. Greece a few years ago, some people in fairly high up positions in Greece said, what could we be doing better here? And I said, well, it's a seasonal business. Why are you not employing other aircraft from other countries that are in their off season? And they go, well, what would we use? I said, how about Australians? We go and steal their business in our winter, their summer. And, that's the verbiage. It's not really, but you know what I'm saying. So why not get some of them? And I said, as an example, South Australia uses a technique where every fire they launch 3 or 4 or more fixed wings that are moving at 150 miles an hour to a fire with a load of retardant, right? And now other assets, whether they're helicopters or possibly larger fixed wings, are going to come later, and they're going to do whatever they're going to do. But there's no magic to firefighting, right? It's like it's not a surprise that there's fire stations in housing areas, because you get a fire, you need to get on it and get it quickly. So that's the way to go, I think. Use a combination of fast-moving fixed wings, smaller if that's what you've got, then some larger fixed wings that are going to get there, and then the larger helicopters, and then the smaller support helicopters. But send it, right? If the worst thing you have to do is turn it around because it turns out it wasn't necessary, that's a pretty small cost compared to not sending it and then having it go into 3-4 week campaign fires that are burning up villages and neighborhoods and forests. I think Greece is doing a pretty good job for a country that doesn't have any money. Now they're affiliated with the EU, and the EU is going to help them out. South Australia has a good program. California has a pretty good program as well, although they're California, so they get sometimes fighting over whose territory it is, and that can be a little bit frustrating for them. And they're not always friendly with each other, which to me is baffling, because if it's a fire, it's a fire. Let's put the thing out and not worry about whether it's San Diego County or San Diego or the National Forest. Yeah. I mean, how ludicrous.
BLM land, right?
Yeah,
private
exactly.
land. Yeah. Fires don't really respect the boundaries between jurisdictions.
No, and if you wait long enough, it'll burn into your jurisdiction, I guarantee it.
Right. So if we zoomed out on that a little bit, and you talked about Greece, not having, tremendous resources. One of the resources, as I look at, is a fair number of fires on which to train on. If you're not having that many fires, you're not having that many, full-scale training opportunities, in which case you're going to have, a marginally trained workforce responding to fires. So would it not make sense, instead of every jurisdiction or every country trying to figure it out on their own, to have, an international wildfire response team that did this for a living every day, every country, and developed expertise that they took from one place to another, rather than everyone trying to figure it out on their own, in many cases in amateur or volunteer capacities.
Right. No, I see exactly what you're saying, Steve. And the thing about that is the EU is doing something this year and then next with a program with shared assets. But when I've seen assets shared in the past, it's the typical government problem of mobilization quick enough to make a difference. In 2007, as an example, in Greece, we were burning up the entire country. There was nothing we could do. So the Russians showed up, the Germans showed up, the French, the Italians. But by the time they got there and got organized, it was kind of more towards the end of things. And now with a system like you're discussing, if you had that, it sounds good and it would work good, except countries like states tend to be dogs in the manger, right? So if let's just say it's a busy fire season in Spain, and there's several aircraft in Spain that could come over, you don't want to be the politician that let those 2 aircraft go over to help Greece, and you lost 3 towns in Spain, right? So they have put a limit on the number that they're going to lend out. But even still, if the situation's dire enough, are they really going to send them? And I guess we'll see this year if they do that, because it's getting to be a warmer climate without getting into that whole discussion. But we're seeing more and larger fires going in North America and Europe. So we'll see if that works. I like your idea of it. I think it's a good, solid concept. But you can't seem to get most countries to agree on what donuts they're having at the meeting, let alone actually put together the assets that would do a sufficient job. Hopefully,
Well, I think if it was a privatized situation where you essentially had what I would describe as the private, SEAL Team 6 of wildfire response that could respond anywhere in the world, they would simply build enough capacity that they could simultaneously handle as many fires as there were. Just like a company that provides security guards at banks, they don't have to move the guard around based on where there's most likely to be a robbery that day. You hire enough people to make sure that everyone's taken care of. And so could you not provide, exclusive use contracts with dedicated crews to be available, full time in any country where they would be needed? And then the government could get out of the fire suppression business, which is strictly, a financial bleed for them. There's no money to be made in fire suppression for a government. But there would be a lot of efficiencies in hiring a private company to handle those duties. Just the way we have FedEx here to get packages places overnight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with your thinking on that. It doesn't seem that we have the desire to really put that together. And so we have to look at the big picture of why is that not what we've been doing all along, right? And we don't even have, other countries have civil protection. Try to look up civil protection in the United States. It's the United States, right? So you have a federal oversight for federal lands, but each state has their own thing, right? California has their own Air Force, as a matter of fact. So you get into the differences between locations, whereas the smaller countries realize that civil protection should be a big part of their budget. The U.S. realizes that, and I'm going to get myself in trouble here, but realizes that the military industrial complex is where the real money is, right?
That's right. Yep.
We can't get the funding to do that. And especially you can't get the funding when you put it in some small bureaucracy like the Forest Service. So you need it out in a larger venue. And and then going back to the U.S., I don't think you're going to see much happen in the United States until it starts affecting people east of the Mississippi, like it did this last season, because the fires were burning in Canada, and the smoke was rolling into Philadelphia and New York and Boston, and people were like, "Oh my God, this is awful." Well, we've had fires that big out west, but they blew into a different locale, like in the southeast, where people don't have the kind of money. So you got 23% of the population west of the Mississippi. Frankly, the other 77% don't care that you're burning up because the money is back east. And if it doesn't affect them by choking them out for smoke, the money's not going to come from them. And I know I digressed into that.
No, you're right on the target. I was quite pleased the day I saw New York fully blanketed in smoke, because I realized finally Wall Street's going to realize, hey, this is a real problem, and we have many countries, but we share the same atmosphere.
Right.
And to think that wildfire is a local problem to anyone's personal economy or air supply, is fallacious.
Right.
That if we have to breathe Canadian smoke, maybe they'll build a wall, but I don't think they will. They'll have to go up thousands of feet, or we go help them figure out how to, contain their smoke to their own country, right? With an assisted wildfire program.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's that's a lot of wall to build through about 7 Great Lakes. So that would be a trick right there. But anyways, I'm sure
Yeah.
somebody probably thinks it's a good
No, I
idea.
mean,
But
the solution, right, is that we recognize that it's a global problem and we attack it together,
right, right,
right?
and we do. But you know, like you mentioned, there's not really the money in that yet until you get the public saying, you know what, maybe we shouldn't be spending billions on the war machine without protecting people in their own country, right? I mean,
Right, right.
uh, or
If
maybe it's
Americans
just
are threatened by somebody foreign, there's $1 billion response, and if they're threatened by a domestic wildfire, there's no response,
yeah,
essentially,
yeah, very, very little.
monetarily speaking. So,
Yeah.
so let's get to this area then of the helicopters that you flew,
Mm-hmm.
or the helicopters you might have wished you'd flown. Let's
Mm-hmm.
say you were looking at a converted Blackhawk, which has been turned into a Firehawk.
Mm-hmm.
This would be a great example of military technology going through a technology transfer to then become civilian technology. And so I suspect that to the degree that we're able to see wildfires as a military threat domestically, threatening Air Force bases, threatening, like the nuclear missile factory in North Texas, that if the military then sees that as a military problem, they would throw huge R&D money into it, giant contracts for developing advanced suppression technologies, and then the technology transfer from military to civilian would be where the civilian market got its huge jump from.
Yeah, I see what you're talking about. Of course, they've released a vast number of Blackhawks to be converted, and there's different companies doing that. The way that the legislation works and the whole system works is that it's not a universal method of conversion. So let me give you a quick talk about that. If uh, if you want to get a Blackhawk and you're some county in Nebraska, you can acquire a Blackhawk for 79 cents or whatever you bid it for, and it looks good to the public because you bought this helicopter cheap instead of buying it for 47 million. It still costs you about $23 million to convert it, but you're working under a different set of rules when you're and this is all FAR or FAA rules. So when you're a county, you're working under a set of rules that means you can convert that aircraft, but it doesn't have to be converted to a standard that Sikorsky would recognize. It doesn't even have to be flown by a helicopter pilot with a license or a medical, but he does have to follow the rules of the air for the FAA. But he doesn't, and he could carry personnel on board where, let's just say, a company like Brainerd Helicopters out of Florida that's been operating Blackhawks for years couldn't possibly fly people on board because they're in a restricted category, right? So it gets to be kind of lengthy and boring stuff, but we've got so many different categories of aircraft and how they're managed that it's not a level playing field, right? And so that same Blackhawk, is it public service? Then it's free to go do what it wants to do. Is it military? It can do almost anything. Is it restricted category? Then it's got more restrictions. Is it Part 135 for carrying passengers? It's highly restricted. So those are all things that work against us as far as utilizing aircraft of that nature. It depends on who buys them and how they get used. Right?
Yeah, boy,
Yeah, I
complexities on
know.
complexities. Yeah, fascinating. Tell me
Yeah.
about the book you're writing.
Well, I've written 2 books, but I'm in the process of rewriting my first book. and talking to different authors, accomplished authors, universally they came up with the same conclusion that the writing's interesting, but unless you're a fascinating individual, do not write in the first person. Now, I must have had some huge pilot ego because I wrote in the first person. I thought, this is things that happened to me, and so wouldn't that be fascinating? Well, like one writer who shall remain nameless pointed out, he says, I've been writing for 30 some years. You know how many stories I've written in the first person? 3 stories. I had enough confidence that my story was interested enough that I could write it in the first person. Do you think you can write 2 books like that? And I went, no, sir, I'm not on the bestseller list for the New York Times like you are 5 different times. So I have to listen to you. And now I have to go and rewrite everything I've done, which isn't that big a deal, but it was a bit of a eye opener that it had never occurred to me that writing in the first person is just like people listening to me right now. They go, yeah, that guy's full of himself. He's fairly boring.
Well, you've earned the right for 1. Your stories are fascinating for 2. And you could take your first manuscript, pop it into ChatGPT and just say, rewrite this in the third person.
Right. Which I have to a certain extent.
But anyone in the writing community will tell you, the art of writing is really the art of rewriting. So You're doing exactly what you're supposed to on that book.
Yeah, I'm an excellent rewriter.
That's
Some
good,
of my earlier work is so bad that it's almost embarrassing. I'm thinking, why did I ever let that out on a blog? I mean, that's bad stuff. But
that's funny. If folks want to catch up with what you're reading, what you're writing, what you're doing, what's the best way to follow you?
I think probably wait about 4 months till the book comes out, because
Okay.
I've got, I'm on Medium. I've got a blog, but I stopped putting much on there, frankly, and maybe I was overly sensitive, but pilots are completely cruel individuals when it comes to critiquing each other. And one of the reasons I just recently got off LinkedIn, because it's just you write something that's, I think, is technically correct, and there's always somebody who's going, no, that's entirely wrong. And I know it's just their point of view. And then I'll get people like, what do you know about the subject? Well, I don't know. I've done it for 45 years. I was considered by most people to be an expert in the subject, but I don't like throwing my resume out there every time I want to justify making an assessment of somebody's flying who I thought was dangerous or hazardous or whatever.
Yeah. Well, it would be a good suggestion across all social media if we didn't say you're wrong, but just simply said, I see it differently.
Yeah.
But as you said, civil defense, and by extension civility, is something that we see less and less of, certainly in this country. And a lost art that I hope will come back. And I'd love to have you back on the show in 4 months as you're getting closer to release the book, and we can talk more about the stories in there. And I want to thank you so much for joining me today. Really fascinating career you've had.
My pleasure, Steve. I hope when you read the book, you realize that it's comprised mostly of errors. Nobody wants to read about flying down the coast of California or Greece on a sunny day. They want to read about the mistakes you made and what you learned from them, or what value you could get as another kind of person reading them. So,
well, that is the value, right? Is how can we learn from what we've seen and do better going forward? And I'm sure that's your goal, is evolution of the art, where you can take what you've learned and pass it on to the next generation of aviators and aerial firefighters. So thank you so much for your service. I look forward to reading your book. And I did mean that. If you wanted to send a manuscript over, I'd love to throw my 2 cents at it.
Well, I can take criticism at this point.
It's not criticism. It's just making the work better. which benefits everyone. So thank you so much, Keith Gill. I appreciate what you've done, what you're doing, and what you'll continue to do. And you said that before you die, you wanted to switch the whole system up from local firefighting to national firefighting. So I hope that you're planning to live another 100 years, because I'm sure it'll take at least that long to enact that change.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. You bet. Thank you all for listening, watching, etc. I'm Steve Wolf. You've been listening to Keith Gill and I chat here on The Fire Break. We're sponsored by Team Wildfire. Check us out on the web, teamwildfire.com. We'll see you at the next one. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thanks, Steve.